All right, well, we need to hurry up and get to this episode, one, because it's on rye, and two, because I'm watching Monday Night Football right now.
Okay. Yeah, I wanna watch football, but I'm not going to rush through this episode. I got a lot to talk about.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll let you guys talk, and I will watch football.
A podcast about bourbon and the ones who drink it. This is Bourbon Matters. Welcome to Bourbon Matters. I'm Jake.
I'm very disappointed about this episode.
And I am Gold Eagle Jake. And you're in for a treat on this episode because this is something I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Not just rye whiskey, but the stigma of I don't like rye.
Dan Davis.
So we've got an interesting panel here. It's the usual crew, but I would say Jake is a huge rye fan. Dan is
Mr. The best rye ever. Oh my God, have you tried this rye?
I'm what you may call a rye fanboy.
Oh, it's so good.
Dan is Mr. Anti-Rye, and
I drink a few ryes.
You all know me.
Dan
I'm
is a closet
Mr.
rye fan.
I like all whiskey, all spirits, and I do think there is a really bad negative stigma around rye whiskey.
Yeah, and
there's
Dan
a
is the
lot of
poster
people
boy
who are afraid of it. A lot of people who haven't tasted enough rye to really give it a real consideration. So I'm excited for this episode, and we're gonna dive into rye. Dan, do you want to start? Why do you not like rye whiskey?
No, I don't want to start.
He's all right. So here's the thing that you gotta know about Dan. Dan will sit there and bitch and moan about rye whiskey, and then every rye I think you've ever tried with me, you're like, "This is a pretty good rye."
No, listen to the episodes we've done on a lot of the ryes. I think I gave Smooth Ambler Founder Series rye a thumbs up. I did not give
Rye 3 Madeira. You said was your favorite rye you tried your whole life.
Not my favorite. My second favorite rye. Saz 18 is my favorite rye. What's that about?
Saz 18.
I can't like good whiskey. Have you had it?
No.
Oh, so don't talk fucking shit about it then, Jake. Jesus.
Let me tell you, somebody who's not a fan of rye would probably not have paid $60 for a pour of that Saz 18.
No, it was 45.
Okay, that's a little bit better.
I after that paid for an $80 pour of Boss Hog Magellan for $80, and it was the worst thing I've ever put in my mouth, and that is saying a lot.
But then another rye.
I know, because I wanted to try good ryes, and it sucked. And if Wilson is listening, I'm sorry. I hate Whistle Pig. I'm just going to throw that out there. Nothing against you, a little bit, but not a lot against you. But Whistle Pig is not my favorite by any stretch of the meaning favorite.
So I think so. Explain why you don't like rye in particular, though. Because there are ryes that you enjoy, but there's a certain thing that you don't like about it, right?
Yeah. So the worst rye I've ever had was the Piggyback 6-year rye.
Yeah,
and I think my tasting notes on it was it tastes like straw. I don't mind the spice kick because the majority of the bourbons that I really enjoy are high rye bourbons. So I do like the spice kick. Mm-hmm. It's the different flavors that you get out of rye. I cannot stand the dill ryes that have the dill flavor to it. I hate dill. I hate anything like that flavor profile. So if I get a hint of dill, it's almost immediately I'm going to be there. It's going to get barely a passing grade. It could be the best dill rye in the world, and it might just barely pass my taste test. If it's more on the mint side, it has a good chance. I don't like it to be super dry, super tannicky, super I feel like I need to drink a gallon of water after I have a sip of rye. I don't like those. The reason I like that Madeira rye from Rye 3 is the Madeira gave a lot of sweetness back into it.
And some smokiness.
some smokiness. I like rum finished ryes because you get a little bit of that sweetness back in with it.
What's a pattern that we're already starting to notice here? And this is something I wanted to talk about.
Finished ryes.
But
even like. Sorry, go
ahead. I don't want to know if I want to jump into it just yet, but like finished rye, I think works way better than finished bourbon.
Yeah, I don't like many finished bourbons.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we'll jump into that a little bit later, but
yeah, that's the main thing. Is those are the two main flavor profiles: your dill or your mint. And I think the other thing with dill is it usually leads to a little bit more sulfury notes to it, and I am very highly sensitive to sulfur, which actually helps when you're distilling because it's a lot easier to find out where to make cuts at. But that's one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of it.
So, Dan, thank you so much for sharing that because you fed right into my point of a lot of people that say they don't like rye haven't tried enough ryes. Mm-hmm. There's much more to rye than dill and mint, which those are two common things that we see with rye. You can get a dilly rye, you can get a minty rye. But I've been wanting to talk about this a lot because there are so many people that I talk to in the bourbon aisle or in the whiskey aisle that I try to recommend a certain rye, and they're like, "Oh, I don't like rye." And I'm like, "What do you mean you don't like rye? Like all of these bourbons have rye in them." And then they kind of look at me blank, and they're just like, "Oh, well, I had this one rye a couple of years ago, and it was so minty. Like I just determined that I don't like rye." So the problem with rye is, one, there's been a negative stigma around it for a long time because everyone just thinks, oh, Canadian whiskey, rye whiskey, it's spicy or it's minty, and I don't like that. And I think it's funny that you mentioned how you don't like Whistle Pig because I think, and it's also funny that Whistle Pig got people to kind of look at rye as not your Canadian cheap whiskey, something that could be a little more premium. And they did that with MGP rye, but now they're going back to using Canadian rye. So there's a lot of moving pieces and parts there. But I think when people think of rye, they tend to just think of Whistle Pig because it was kind of the first premium rye whiskey to come into the market and have success. But they've since switched from MGP back to Canadian. So they've lost a lot of their like hardcore whiskey people, I do think. But there's still people out there who love Whistle Pig just for, I think, the brand and the name that it has behind it. And they're still putting out good whiskey, but it's just different liquid in the bottle than what first was. But so to dive in,
one other,
go ahead.
Real quick, one other thing that's interesting to think about with rye whiskey is, like we've talked before about the stigma around bourbon in like the 70s and 80s, and the aversion to, aged liquor, that kind of pushed bourbon and whiskey in general out of the market space, in favor of your tequilas, vodkas, and gins. And like at that time, like bourbon was what your dad drank or what your grandpa drank, but rye whiskey was what your great grandpa drank. So like it's always been associated with like super old people or like super old fashioned, like times and mentality, and so I think a lot of people just kind of dismissed it as like super old fashioned and out of touch.
Yeah, I agree.
And just blew it off,
So yeah, I think that kind of paved a lot of the negative stigma, but then also more recently with people who are really getting into whiskey and connoisseurs, if you will, may have tried a certain rye, didn't like that rye, and just assumed all rye is going to taste like that. Because the biggest thing I've found with rye is there's much more variation bottle to bottle than there is with bourbon. If you try 10 bourbons from the same distillery with the same mash bill, you're going to pick up a lot of similar flavor notes but you can take a 95.5 MGP rye in 5 different bottles, and they can taste totally different bottle to bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I kind of split rye into 4 categories. You can get like a really floral and really earthy rye. You can get a really spicy rye from the rye directly itself. You can get a really sweet rye, and you can also get a really minty or dilly rye. And within those 4 categories, I think there's a lot more variation that you can break down even further.
Yeah, for sure. And like I think rye was probably the first whiskey I had besides Jack Daniels or Jameson, and it was Whistle Pig 10. And I actually bought rye because that's what they drink on Mad Men in their old fashions. And then I went to bourbon. I think one of the things that's off-putting to people who start with bourbon is that it's really sweet, and you go to rye, and rye is typically not. And I think, Jake, you've made this point before, that the American palate tends to gravitate towards sweetness over other flavor profiles. So it's just, it's off-putting if you're used to that sweeter kind of profile. Then you go to those spicy or floral or minty kind of palates, you know?
Yeah, and we also don't like surprises. When we buy something, we want to know what we're getting. So like when you go and buy a bottle of Elijah Craig, whether it's the toasted, whether it's the regular small batch, the barrel proof, you know what kind of flavor profile you're getting. You're getting a lot of sweetness. You're getting a lot of corn. And you're getting a little hint of that rye spice, where you go and buy Elijah Craig regular rye or the Elijah Craig toasted rye, and they have very different flavor profiles just from bottle to bottle. And same, you know, going back to the 95.5 MGP, I've had 95.5 MGP that tasted really, really spearminty. I've had 95.5 that tasted really sweet. I've had 95.5 that tasted really fruity. And also that same mash bill that's just like all spice and floral in your face. So I think there's a lot of variation with rye. I think it kind of had a negative stigma back before this whole whiskey boom. And so a lot of people are just naturally afraid of it and staying away.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for Dan to like butt in and tell us we're wrong. And
I was busy on my phone because I just got upgraded to first class for my flight. So,
wow, good to see what you think's important when we're recording. But so I've got a quick little story then, and then we can just kind of debate and talk more about rye whiskey. So we're gonna call him Rye Guy. We're gonna call him Rye Guy, because I'm not going to call anybody out on the podcast, but there's a guy called Rye Guy. He's part of the Lake County Whiskey Club. Lake County Whiskey Club does a lot of blind tastings at our store. They do one monthly, and Rye Guy reached out and said he will never come to a tasting until we promise that there's no rye, because at least one of the 3 rounds have typically been rye whiskey. So he's like, I don't like rye. I don't want to sign up for a blind tasting because I don't like rye at all, and I'm not going to enjoy that round. And we've said, you know, sorry, but like the way we do it's the way we do it. We don't give out information on what's going to be poured. It's just a blind tasting, and you just got to come and figure it out. So Rye Guy, in last year's advent calendar for Lake County Whiskey Club, which by the way was a really, really good calendar, and I'm starting to learn that Rye Guy doesn't have the best palate because there were some really, really good things that he didn't like. But Rye Guy, the first 4 days, commented on the thread saying, I'm guessing this is a rye because I really don't like it. That was each day for the first 4 days. Day 5 comes.
Which can't be possible, right?
Which can't be possible. So the first 4 days, to spoil it, were all bourbon. And then day 5 comes, which is the first rye. And he comments saying, "This is amazing. I really, really like this. It must not be a rye." Hey, guess what, rye guy? This is the first rye in the calendar. So the takeaway and the thing with rye that I get from that is, hey, if you think you don't like rye, you just probably haven't had the rye that you're going to like, because they are very, very different bottle to bottle. You need to try more whiskey in order to really determine that you don't like a certain category. And yeah, you can have a really floral, earthy rye. You can have a really spicy rye. You can have a really sweet rye. You can have a really minty rye. And the rye that he liked, which was day 5, was a Peerless single barrel rye. Which
was
Peerless
it
is
mesquite?
Yeah, it was the sweet mesquite.
Oh yeah, but I mean that's an absolutely incredible whiskey.
Well,
so.
but then Peerless is a really good example to talk about with rye, because all of their single barrels are all between 4 and 7 years old, and they taste much older and much more complex. But they all taste so vastly different, just from barrel to barrel to barrel. So like Peerless is one of those ryes that could fit into each of those categories of sweet, spicy, minty, or floral. But he just happened to get a really sweet one. There's also a lot of Peerless ryes I've tasted that I would totally guess they were a bourbon if I tasted them blind, because a lot of them have a lot of sweetness to it. But yeah, Mr. Rye Guy, the first thing he liked in the calendar was the first rye. Supposedly he doesn't like ryes.
Yeah.
So I will speak on behalf of Rye Guy, and yes, Jake is a jerk.
He didn't name names. It's all right.
I didn't name any names. I'm just pointing out.
Neither did I.
Theories.
Either one of you.
Theories that I created was literally just proven true in that example, and that it happens all the time. It happens all the time with people that I talk to in the aisle. They're like, I'm not even going to look at your rye section because I don't like rye. But then it's like, how many ryes have you tried? They're like, oh, I've tried, 2-3 different ones, and I wasn't really a fan.
And they're all just MGP.
Probably, but even within MGP, you can find such variation bottle to bottle with the same mash bill.
Yeah, definitely.
And I guess...
I mean, that's a good point. So, like, maybe let's highlight some different brands that fall within those 4 categories. Because I like, people aren't going to know, like,
no, you're not going to know. You're not going to know, and I do have some brands listed out under each of these categories. But I think the whole point here is you can't just say you don't like. Okay, it's one thing to say I don't like peated Scotch, because that's a very distinct flavor profile. But I don't think it's fair to say
that, though, you can find a little bit of nuance.
You might, but if someone, when I'm trying to recommend a Scotch to someone, the first question I ask is, okay, do you like peated or unpeated? And if they're like, oh, I don't like peat at all, I'm not going to try and sell them on a Lafroig, even though I think it's mellow for peat lovers,
Right.
So there's a finer line when it comes to Scotch than when it comes to American whiskey and rye whiskey. Because we know that the same mash bill from the same distillery might taste totally different bottle to bottle. So let's start with floral and earthy ryes. First thing that comes to mind for me is Castle and Key.
Yeah, that's for sure. Very, very much in that, like, it's almost like herbal tea kind of notes. In a lot of the cases.
Definitely some herbal tea, definitely almost like some botanicals going on.
Yeah. Very bright overall.
Very bright, very fruity. but then like you get some earthiness, you get some grassiness.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You get a little bit of dill. Which that's what I'm sipping on right now is our Castle and Key rye barrel pick.
Ooh. Those are usually pretty good.
Yeah. I think Hard Truth can fall in there too. Sometimes I think they like teeter on the edge of floral and minty. But I don't get dill on Hard Truth. Right, Dan?
I think the last time I had Hard Truth was a malted rye, which I wasn't a fan of either. So that's a totally different flavor in itself. So
Hard Truth, I get a lot of sweetness. Like I would put them in my sweet category.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You get a lot of richness, a lot of sweetness. Even though they're pretty high rye, you could definitely confuse a certain Hard Truth for a bourbon.
Yeah, and they're like, oh god, 95, or no, they might be even.
Yeah,
94% rye. I can't remember.
I think
they're almost
pretty sure one of their mash bills is 94, but yeah, Hard Truth would be a good sweet one. If you want a really good sweet rye, check out Buzzard's Roost. They're like barely legal ryes, and they're all double oaked in some way. Some of them are French oak, some of them toasted oak. But the Buzzard's Roost, I thought, was a really good lineup of rye whiskey.
A lot of Kentucky ryes will be pretty sweet in general.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. A lot of Kentucky ryes typically have higher corn content.
Yeah, so usually those are just barely legal ryes.
Yeah, the Elijah Craig rye is
Elijah Craig.
Sweet.
Also, Knob Creek. If you want a good 51% rye, the Knob Creek rye is phenomenal, especially if you get a good single barrel.
They just dropped a 10-year.
Yeah, we've got the 10-year. The 10-year is so good. 100 proof, 10 years old, and $70 a bottle. Spicy. I think this is the category that turns a lot of people off from rye whiskey. Is some ryes you just get so much spice all up front and like a tingling sensation on your palate that I think a lot of people, when they taste that, and if they're not ready for the spice or they're not used to the spice, will just immediately set them back. My spicy example I had was the Dancing Goat rye that's finished in French oak, because not only do you get the spice from the MGP rye, but you also get the spice from the French oak, and if you don't like spice, stay away from that.
Yeah, I was going to say Old Elk is pretty spicy. Definitely has that like pepper and like clove and maybe cinnamon, but much more heavy in that like clove allspice kind of baking spice area.
You can also get a really fruity rye, and a good fruity rye is the Bardstown rye.
Yeah.
Because they finish it's a 95.5 rye, but they finish it in toasted cherry wood. So you get a lot of sweetness from the toasted oak, and then you get a lot of fruit from the cherry wood. Mm-hmm. But that I think is a phenomenal beginner's rye, especially at that 95.5 mash bill. It's funny because most of our listeners probably know Justin from HLP Systems. He's a claimer of not being a big fan of rye, and he's also a big claimer of not liking finished whiskey. But his barrel pick this year for HLP System was the Bardstown rye, which is a finished rye. So he went against his two big no-nos in whiskey and picked a barrel of it and absolutely loved it. He also said his dad. This is like they've done some really killer picks. Like every one of their barrel picks has been phenomenal, but this one he said is the first one that his dad really, really enjoys. And his dad usually sticks to Canadian whiskey. Crown Royal is his jam, but it's a really unique rye because you get that 95.5 spice, but you get a lot of fruitiness from that toasted cherry oak that they use. So I think the Bardstown rye is a really good first rye to go to and grab.
Yeah.
What else, Dan?
Yeah, great. Go Bardstown. Good job, Bardstown.
Yeah, what else, Dan? You've been a little quiet this episode.
I know a really good minty rye.
Whiskey Acres?
Whiskey Acres.
Yeah.
All day, every day. Oh, yeah.
Whiskey
Talk
Acres
about the
Big
Whiskey Acres rye,
is
Dan.
extremely good.
Because the Whiskey Acres Bottled and Bond is a very good rye, and I think it's approachable to all different types of whiskey drinkers.
And it's like so versatile. I love to use it in a base in like almost every cocktail. Because it does have a little bit of sweetness, but like Dan said, it's got some of that mintiness. So in an old fashioned, it really stands up, but also can kind of blend in like a Manhattan or the Old Pal is another favorite of mine. I think I did a quick cocktail YouTube video on the Old Pal. It's a nice equal parts rye, Campari, and dry vermouth. But that's one where you need something robust to stand up to the Campari, or else it just tastes like bitter Campari. And the Whiskey Acres does a really good job there.
Yes, we do. We do a phenomenal job.
What's the mash bill on that, Dan?
75 rye, 25 corn.
Undefeated
Rye
in blinds at Gold Eagle. The Whiskey Acres Bottled and Bond rye.
Oh, also finished better than Parker's Heritage 10-year rye. Weird.
In
I think
San Francisco?
When we
touch on that, Dan. Brag about that. There's a lot of people here who are probably looking for their next rye. So yeah, Ascot Awards, the Whiskey Acres rye took down Parker's Heritage rye,
which is we got a double platinum, and which is the highest you can get at Ascot, and Parker's Heritage 10-year got a platinum. Bitches. Heaven Hill can suck my D.
But you're not drinking Whiskey Acres tonight.
No, I decided to drink something different tonight because I'm trying to finish off this bottle. I'm not finishing this off tonight.
Oh, James Pepper is another
good one.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another example of it's 95.5 MGP rye, but it has a lot of fruitiness, a lot of citrus, a lot of liveliness that you don't typically find. Maybe that bottle is different.
This one's very oaky as well.
Okay, yeah.
No, it's got a little bit of fruity citrus, but it's very oaky as well.
Mm-hmm.
I like that one. But no, I think the problem that you face, and I think, I don't know, there are people that just say they don't like rye, and like you've talked about.
There's tons of people like that.
There's also a lot of people. Yeah, there are. But I think of that group, people misspeak about what they actually mean. Because what I think when I go to Gold Eagle and I see all the bourbons on the shelf that I haven't tried, then I see all the ryes. Are there some good ryes I'm missing? Yes, but a really good rye is still usually middle range bourbon for me. And for me, I would rather take up another bourbon I know I have a lot higher chance I'm going to like than a rye. And I think it's just easier to say I don't like rye instead of saying that, like, well, a really good rye is still mid-tier for me.
Or it's just a really good smoke screen.
Just as good.
To be able to pivot and say, I don't want to talk about rye because, I'd rather spend my money on a bourbon because that's what I like is bourbon. It's America.
Maybe you should learn to overcome objections as a salesperson better, Jake.
Rye is more American than bourbon. rye is the first whiskey distilled in America.
Yeah, and then people learned what flavor was.
So
George Washington made rye.
I'm gonna throw George something Washington, out there.
Let's not get into what George Washington did and ignore a bunch of other things George Washington also did. Let's not paint him as a perfect just because he drank rye, okay?
What do you have a problem with, Dan? The founding of America?
He cut down a cherry. He cut down a cherry tree, ruining the environment.
He admitted that he lied about it. That's the key takeaway, Dan.
He told the truth.
But so I'm going to throw something out there, and hopefully some listeners will give us feedback on this, because Gold Eagle has recently debated about getting rid of our rye section and mixing in.
There, and everyone will say yes. Just getting rid of our rye section, and everyone will be like,
perfect.
Yeah, I'm on board.
Yeah. So our whole thought process behind this was we shouldn't have a rye section because there are so many people who are missing out on great ryes because they just don't look at that section. And your Knob Creek fans might love a Knob Creek 10-year rye, or a Knob Creek Bourbon and rye, or a Knob Creek single barrel rye, but they don't know that there is that option. A lot of people come into the aisle, they look for Knob Creek, they look for Maker's Mark, which doesn't have a rye, they look for Old Forester, and they don't even know that these brands might have a different whiskey out there because it's in a completely separate shelf than their distillery. So our thought process is, what if, well, I know for a fact that a lot of these people that say they don't like rye just haven't tasted enough ryes. But what if we're missing out on a ton of sales because your huge Knob Creek fan is like, oh, I didn't know they had a 10-year rye for $60, $70. I didn't know they had a bourbon and rye blend for, I think it's like $45 for that bottle. Mm-hmm. So I want to hear from you guys, and I also want to hear from listeners in the comments section. What would you feel? What would you recommend if we got rid of our rye section and just started to put all the distilleries together based on their location instead of doing a whole entire separate rye section?
You know, for me, it's not always fun to have to go to 2, sometimes 3 different sections if I want to see what a particular brand is put out. For those that are following along at home, the 3rd section is American Single Malt. So I think consolidating brands together, I think, is a great idea. So you can see the full scope of what that brand offers in one place.
And I'm going to pause you right there, because the plus side of that is, yes, you're going to see the whole brand, but the downside is we've had people come and return bottles because they're like, oh, I bought the Yellowstone single malt and I thought it was the bourbon. Can I swap it out?
Well, you should try it.
No, you absolutely should. And I totally agree with you. I'm on board. I think more people are brand loyal than, just like, oh, I want to look for whatever, a new bourbon. Like if you already like Yellowstone, you're more likely to try something different from that distillery than a different single malt from another distillery that you'd never heard of.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want to hijack the episode, entirely, but
I think that's me being just devil's advocate.
I want to stop everyone right there real quick, though, first, too, because if you're listening to this, you probably just wondered. And yes, Jake has to go to 3 different aisles in the liquor section for whiskey every time because he has a problem. Yes.
Yes.
100% alcoholic. I just wanted to make sure that if you were thinking that, you're right in thinking that, because that is true.
Well,
so make sure we're on the same page.
One of the things, too, I think that's interesting to think about is one of the reasons why American Single Malt may not be doing as well as people may have thought is because it's usually shoved in the back of the Scotch section instead of near the American whiskeys. and that no one from that's in the bourbon aisle usually wanders over to the Scotch section, so they usually miss that stuff. But
they think it's going to be peaty and Scotch like.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to kind of group everything together. Makes it easier for me. But
makes
it's
it
also
easier for alcoholics. So
I think it's a better
connoisseurs, Dan.
Yeah,
another word for it.
Collectors
and connoisseurs. Yeah. But Dan, be real for a second.
Jake, real.
As a distiller, as somebody who works for a distillery, as somebody who loves bourbon but supposedly doesn't like rye as much, what's your take on...
Not supposedly, I don't like rye as much. It's not supposedly, I don't like rye as much.
Well, it's supposedly, because nobody actually doesn't like rye. You just haven't tasted enough ryes to figure out the quality of rye whiskey.
I think it's good to have variation. No one wants to drink the same thing over and over. That's why there's so many different labels out there. That's why so many different labels do so well. I'm on Jake's train of thought that ryes work better in cocktails than what bourbon does. I'm not going to ignore that. But I think rye whiskey as a base is just not a lot of people's flavor profile. I think that's why I know we talked briefly on it, on the finishes and things, where you can add some additional sweetness, cut down some of the hard spice that people don't like, cut down some of the sulfur notes, cut down some of the dill notes, cut down some of the mint notes by adding a little bit of sweetness in via a rum cask or a Madeira cask, or there's a bunch of different ones that they're using anymore these days. I think that definitely helps. But it's got to be the right thing. Because, when we had Rye 3 on, the Madeira cask was, really the only one I enjoyed. I enjoyed it a lot, but it was really the only one I enjoyed. And there were some other sweet finishes in there, too, that I didn't think tasted as good. Finishes are always iffy for me. But I do enjoy... there's a better chance of me enjoying a rye if it's finished than straight. And it's the exact opposite of bourbon, where I'm less likely to like a bourbon that's finished versus straight.
Yeah, you're kind of a purist in general, though, and you don't like finishes on nearly anything.
Like the classics, like a crotchety old man would, Jake.
So I think that's a perfect transition to what we kind of hinted and talked a little bit about earlier, was that finished ryes work a lot better than finished bourbon.
Yeah.
I do think the natural spice that you get from rye, one, holds better in a cocktail, which we all can agree on. Your Manhattan, your Old Fashioned, there's a lot more depth when you use a rye, because you do get that spice in there that plays really nice with the sweetness. And I think the same thing carries over to finished rye versus finished bourbon. I think a lot of bourbon's just ready to go as it is out of the barrel, and the finishing cask is almost like, hey, we just want to do something different. Whereas with rye, you can play with that sweet cask and add it with the spice of the rye to create a super long finish, in-depth product. So I do think that finished ryes work a lot better than finished bourbons, and that's why we see a lot more finished ryes. So yeah, I think that's a good talking point.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't know why. Well, I do know why.
It's that sweet spice combo.
Well, a lot of bourbon is finished with other sweet things, and it's because people like super sweet stuff.
They're I think they're trying to get excitement going.
Yeah.
It's hey, let's take this bourbon that's already has a little bit of excitement. Let's put it in orange curacao. Let's put it in a double oak barrel. Let's put it in a Madeira cask or a sherry cask, and let's enhance this. But no, it kind of backfires a little bit because you get double sweet. Whereas with a rye, you get spice and sweet, and it creates a lot of depth and also a good palate.
Yeah, the depth, like you said, and the complexity that you get from finishing rye, I think is especially worth noting compared to bourbon. I've said a few times on the show, including in the Rye 3 episode, that Amberana finished ryes are one of the only places I think Amberana actually works. Also, rum finished ryes.
Dark Arts Rye.
Absolutely no brainer. Yeah. Any of those super sweet wines, like the Angel's Envy Ice Cider Cask Finish Rye is so good because you get that super sweet cider finish with basically, at that time, I think it was MGP rye. And they just pair so well together. And like, that's like cooking and baking 101, is you take savory and sweet, put them together, and then you get super balanced, super nuanced flavor combinations.
And also the regular Angel's Envy rye.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think the rum cask finish rye had a major role in getting people to, no pun intended, they piggybacked off of Whistle Pig and made people realize, hey, we can have a super premium rye whiskey that is going to appeal to any whiskey drinker, not just rye whiskey drinkers, bourbon drinkers, because you get the sweetness from the rum, you get the spice from the rye, and it creates a super in-depth final product.
For sure. So I can tell Dan has had an absolute blast on this episode.
It's been great.
The only thing I want to touch on real quick is I'm doing a first for me tonight, and I'm drinking a rye whiskey from outside the United States and Canada. I'm trying the Stauning Danish whiskey.
Ooh, so that was one of the ones I was going to talk about too.
This is a floor malted rye whiskey. This is entirely composed of rye and malted barley. So there is no corn in this. Dan's going to give me shit, but I do like this. It's tasty. It, however, is extremely different from American rye and Canadian rye.
It's almost like a rye single malt.
Yeah, it's super bready. Like it really tastes like a really good piece of rye bread. But also that the barley really brings in some of those like younger single malt flavors with like some fruits and stuff. So it's almost like a nice toasted rye bread with like an orange jelly or something on it.
It's kind of like a soft, approachable, but a little bit of spice rye.
Yeah, it's not super spicy, but it's got a little bit there. It's more in like the black pepper kind of realm,
which I think
the rye
goes back to what we were talking about with there's just so many different variations of rye and so much complexity and depth from bottle to bottle, even if it has the same mash bill. And we didn't even talk about the different types of rye with like chocolate malted rye and regular malted rye, and Chattanooga rye is a great example of the chocolate malted rye because you get a ton of chocolate on that. But yeah, I think to kind of sum this up and get close to wrapping this up, there's just so much variation within rye whiskey, and mash bill to the similar mash bill in a different bottle is going to taste totally different sometimes than, bourbon to bourbon if we're doing comparisons between the categories.
Yeah, I'd challenge people that think they don't like rye to try the Stauning Danish rye whiskey. It is not going to be what you expect or what you've tasted in rye before. So it might be something that you really enjoy.
I challenge everyone who thinks they don't like rye to reopen that mindset. Go out there and just taste rye whiskey like it's bourbon or like it's just any other whiskey. And if really, truly the next 5-10 things you try you don't like, okay, fine. Maybe you're not a rye whiskey drinker, but there's just so much variation bottle to bottle, even comparing the same mash bills as we talked about, that I really don't think there's anyone out there who can truly say they don't like rye at all.
Yeah.
And Jake, I wasn't going to say anything when you said you really liked that stunning rye. I wasn't going to say anything you thought I was going to say. I was just going to say that there's two things I can't tolerate, and that's people that are inconsiderate of other people's countries and the Dutch. Where's my Austin Powers crowd at? Come on now. Awesome. Well, before we go into plugs then, we will be doing one more episode for the end of 2024. That'll be coming out next week. That'll be our annual. Each of us will go through our top 5 whiskeys. We talked the other day. Thank God Jake is not putting stipulations on what you can say and what you can't say was one of your top 5 whiskeys. This is the dumbest effing thing I've ever heard in my life. Oh, you really like that one? Yeah, you can't include it because it was a star pick.
Last year we were trying to do Findable, and this year I got in trouble for doing C923, so no rules this year.
Yeah. We got to do Findable whiskey. Oh, this one that you can't find. That's my favorite whiskey of the year.
That was true. That was bogus.
I got 3 of them, so it was Findable for me.
Well, that's because you also have a problem. We discussed this earlier. So that will be coming up next week. Will be our top 5s. And that'll be our last episode for 2024, and then we will get ready for 2025. Jake, if people want to find some ryes in the rye aisle or try some in the tasting area, where can they do that at?
255 Pearson Road, goldeaglewine.com. Also going to throw in a coupon code. So Castle and Key, single barrel rye. This is a 3.5 year. It sells for $64.99, and every time I look back, I should reset here. When we first got these bottles in, and I looked back, and I was like, wait, why did we pick a 3.5-year-old rye whiskey that's going to sell for $65? That might have been a mistake. And then I taste this bottle, and I realized, okay, that's why. Another thing about rye is you can get away with a really young product sometimes, and you kind of need to throw out all the stats out of the door and just taste the whiskey when it comes to rye whiskey. So I'll finish on that note. Sometimes age, mash bill doesn't really make a difference with rye. It just depends on how it tastes, and you can get huge variation bottle to bottle. We're going to do $10 off our Castle and Key barrel pick. So instead of $64.99, you can get it for $54.99. It's only 3.5 years, but it has a ton of flavor. It has a little bit of minty spice, has a lot of floral and earthy notes, but also a lot of sweetness. So I think it touches on a couple different categories of rye. Use the code BMKEY for $10 off a bottle of our Castle and Key rye barrel pick. So BMKEY. You can order that at goldeaglewine.com. Follow us on Instagram at Gold Eagle Wine. Follow us on Facebook at Gold Eagle Spirits. And that coupon code is only valid online.
Jake, where can people watch our episodes, watch our top 5? Where can they listen to previous episodes through the year? They might maybe hear about some whiskeys that we talked about throughout the year that are in our top 5?
So, real quick, that particular single barrel pick from Castle and Key is probably in my top 5 ryes of all time.
Shocker.
Ooh,
Maybe
let's
top
go.
10 whiskeys
Jake,
of all
you're
time.
the only person I know that has a top 5 ryes that's 30 pages long.
I just said top 10 whiskeys of all time.
Wow.
So get bent. You can watch us on Spotify and YouTube. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or any other podcast platform. Make sure you follow, subscribe, rate. Make sure you comment about what you think Gold Eagle should do with their whiskey section.
Yeah, I was going to say definitely comment, because that is something we're seriously considering.
Yeah. I'm curious to see what people say about it. So I'm pretty set in my position on it. So
I've got one more thing to throw out there that I can't believe we didn't talk about.
Yeah.
What's that?
Midwinter.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Sad.
I think it's sad. It's awful. But it still sells out immediately every year when it comes out, and it's mostly bourbon drinkers. It's a rye whiskey, but it's mostly bourbon drinkers that buy it, and I think they don't even pay attention that what they're drinking is rye. They're just like, "Ooh, it's allocated, it's limited, and I'm gonna buy a bottle."
It's super sweet though. So
it's sweet, it's fruity, but it just lacks all complexity and depth. It's just like one noted. You get a little bit of floral and fruity spice, and that's it. Goes away.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I'm so glad we did this episode.
Can I tease our January event real quick, though?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
The Revenge of Jake R is coming this January. Be prepared. Keep an eye out for tickets to go on sale for the Blend Off Part 2, The Reckoning. I'm hitting hard this year.
I think you said that last year.
I'm not going for my flavor. I'm going for the crowd favorites. So
I already told these guys, just so everyone on the podcast that listens that's going to show up there is aware of this. I said my goal this year is to try and create a worse whiskey than Jake. And I don't know if it's going to be possible. That's my goal this year. You laugh. That's what I'm going to try and do.
I think you're setting yourself up for an excuse if you lose.
No,
Dan's trying to lower expectations, so when he gets blown out of the water, he can't talk shit.
If I was afraid of you making a better blend than me, I would be, but I have no worries about that.
And we'll talk about the rules as we get closer to that. I think we might just do same rules from last year, but we'll see.
All right, guys.
Yeah, make sure you watch Top Whiskeys of the Year next week. We'll see you next year.
Cheers.
See ya.
Cheers.
Cheers.